The Copa Room at the Sands Hotel, Las Vegas, March 15, 1965. 10:47 in the evening. Dean Martin stands center stage under warm amber lights. The band plays softly behind him. Nelson Riddle's arrangement of Ain't That a Kick in the Head. The audience of 800 sits in comfortable darkness, drinks in hand, ready for another perfect Vegas evening. Dean's voice flows across the room like expensive whiskey, smooth, controlled, effortless. But something is wrong. The band senses it first, a tension creeping into the rhythm. Nelson Riddle's eyes flick toward the front row, then back to his music stand. In the premium seating, directly in Dean's line of sight, a man in a perfectly tailored suit makes a gesture. Subtle, silent, unmistakable. It is not applause. Dean sees it. His voice never wavers, but his eyes lock onto the figure in the front row for exactly 3 seconds. The band continues playing. The audience remains unaware, but everyone on stage understands that something has shifted. The man in the front row of the Copa Room that March night represented this system. He wasn't there as a customer. He was there as an enforcer. Someone had decided that Dean Martin's performance needed to end immediately. Perhaps Dean had said something earlier that evening that displeased the wrong person. Perhaps he'd ignored a suggestion about his set list. Perhaps he'd been seen with the wrong woman or avoided the right party. The reasons didn't matter. What mattered was compliance. And compliance in 1965 Las Vegas was not optional. Dean Martin had been born Dino Paul Crosetti in Steubenville, Ohio in 1917, steel mill town, immigrant family, poverty that shaped character rather than breaking it. By age 16, Dean was boxing professionally, not from love of sport, but from need of money. He worked in illegal gambling operations because legal work paid too little to matter. These weren't romantic adventures, they were survival lessons. The most important lesson: fear is a choice, not a circumstance. When Dean moved to New York, then Hollywood, then Las Vegas, he carried that steel mill education with him. Other entertainers saw their careers as their identity. Dean saw his career as his current job. Frank Sinatra needed approval from powerful people to feel complete. His explosive temper came from the frustration of someone who required external validation but could never fully control who provided it. Dean Martin needed approval from no one to sleep peacefully. This psychological independence was so rare in the entertainment world that it often confused people. Industry executives couldn't understand how to motivate someone who genuinely didn't care about the rewards they controlled. How do you threaten someone who isn't afraid of losing what they have? How do you intimidate someone who has already survived worse circumstances than anything you can create? How do you pressure someone who doesn't want anything you're offering? The answer, as the man in the front row was about to discover, is simple: you can't. Dean had been poor before. He could be poor again. He'd been unknown before. He could be unknown again. He'd been irrelevant before. He could be irrelevant again. None of these possibilities frightened him, because Dean understood something that eluded most successful people: the difference between losing everything and losing everything that matters. And the only things that mattered to Dean Martin were things that no one in any front row could take away from him. The gesture comes during Dean's third song, Volare. The orchestra swells during the bridge, and Dean steps toward the front of the stage, closer to the audience. That's when he sees it clearly. The man in the front row, expensive suit, perfectly groomed, sitting alone at a table that should seat 4, draws his finger slowly across his throat. The motion is deliberate, visible, meant to be seen. Dean's voice never wavers. He continues singing as if nothing has happened, but his eyes remain fixed on the figure for exactly 3 seconds longer than any casual glance would last. The man repeats the gesture, slower this time, more emphatic. The message is unmistakable. Stop singing. leave the stage, end this performance immediately. Nelson Riddle notices the exchange. His conducting becomes slightly more mechanical as he processes what he's witnessed. The trumpet player in the second row of the orchestra sees it too. His notes become less certain. The audience remains oblivious. They hear Dean Martin delivering another flawless performance. They see him moving with his characteristic ease and confidence. They don't see the conversation happening in silence between the stage and the front row. Dean reaches the end of Volare. The orchestra provides the final flourish. The audience applauds warmly, expecting the smooth transition to the next song that has become Dean's trademark. Instead, Dean steps forward, closer to the microphone, closer to the front row. The applause fades. The room grows quiet. Dean looks directly at the man who threatened him, holds eye contact for 5 full seconds. 5 seconds that feel like 5 minutes to everyone who understands what's happening. Then Dean speaks, not to the audience, to one man, but his words carry across the entire Copa room. "You know," Dean says, his voice carrying the same casual warmth he's used all evening, "I was just thinking about something my old man used to tell me back in Steubenville." He pauses, takes a sip of the drink that's always present during his performances. The gesture is unhurried, relaxed. He used to say, "Dino, if you're going to threaten somebody, you better make sure you can follow through." The words land in the Copa room like stones dropped into still water. The audience doesn't fully understand what they're hearing, but they sense the weight of it. Dean continues, his tone never changing, never becoming hostile or confrontational, simply conversational. Because if you can't follow through, you're not making a threat, you're making a request. He looks directly at the man in the front row, smiles, the same easy smile he's used for 20 years of performances. "I don't really take requests during the show." The silence that follows is absolute. 800 people hold their breath without knowing why. The man in the front row sits frozen. His perfectly calculated intimidation has been transformed into something else entirely. Public humiliation, in front of witnesses, in front of people who will remember this moment for the rest of their lives. But Dean isn't finished. However, he continues, his tone never changing, never becoming hostile or confrontational, simply conversational. "If you'd like to discuss your concerns privately, I'll be in my dressing room after the show. You and me. No audience, no orchestra, no microphone." Another pause, another sip of his drink. "We can settle whatever's bothering you like gentlemen." The offer hangs in the air like smoke. Dean has just done the impossible. He's taken a public threat and turned it into a private invitation. He's removed the intimidation from the gesture by acknowledging it directly. And most importantly, he's demonstrated that he's not afraid of the consequences. The man in the front row stares at Dean Martin, calculating, recalibrating, trying to understand how his position of power has suddenly become a position of exposure. Dean nods politely. "Until then, we've got a show to finish." He turns back to Nelson Riddle. "Take it from the top of Everybody Loves Somebody." The orchestra begins playing. Dean's voice flows across the room as if nothing has happened, but everything has changed.
The transformation is subtle but absolute. 800 people have just witnessed something unprecedented. A public challenge to hidden authority met with calm invitation rather than fearful compliance. The man in the front row sits in his chair for 30 seconds longer. His perfectly tailored suit suddenly seems less impressive. His solitary table now feels exposed rather than commanding. He stands, straightens his jacket, walks toward the exit without looking back. His departure is noticed by those who understand what just happened: industry people, casino executives, other performers in the audience. They watch him leave with fascination and terror. Fascination because they've just seen someone successfully refuse intimidation. Terror because they understand that what worked for Dean Martin would destroy anyone else. Dean continues performing as if the most dangerous man in the room hadn't just threatened his life and then been forced to leave in humiliation. The audience gradually relaxes. Whatever tension they sensed has passed. The show returns to its expected rhythm of music, laughter, and carefully crafted entertainment. But backstage, the story is already beginning to spread. Word moves quickly in Las Vegas. By the time Dean's performance ends, every major figure in the city's entertainment hierarchy has heard some version of what happened in the Copa Room. The details vary, the interpretations differ, but the essential fact remains consistent. Dean Martin was threatened publicly and responded by making the threat impossible to follow through on. Not through violence, not through counter-threats, not through appealing to higher authority, through perfect psychological control. No newspaper covers the story, no police reports are filed, no official statements are issued. This is how real power operates in Las Vegas, through whispers rather than headlines, through private understanding rather than public declaration. According to those who were there, the man in the front row never appeared in Dean's dressing room that night. The private conversation Dean offered never took place, because the public humiliation had already settled the matter. Witnesses later described an atmosphere of quiet amazement. Not celebration, no one was foolish enough to celebrate the embarrassment of dangerous people, but amazement at what they'd witnessed. Dean Martin had faced down a killer without raising his voice, without making threats, without even acknowledging that a threat had been made. He'd simply refused to be intimidated. And somehow, impossibly, that refusal had been enough. The story spreads through the underground networks of Las Vegas, not as gossip, but as education, a case study in how real power actually works when stripped of its theatrical elements. Frank Sinatra hears about it within hours. His reaction, according to those close to him, is complex. Admiration mixed with envy, respect combined with resentment. Because Frank knows he could never have done what Dean did. Frank's power comes from belonging to the system, from being connected to the right people and maintaining those connections through careful navigation of their expectations. Dean's power comes from standing outside the system entirely, from being genuinely indifferent to its rewards and therefore immune to its punishments. The difference between these two approaches to survival becomes crystal clear that March night in the Copa Room. Frank needs Las Vegas. Dean Martin could walk away tomorrow and sleep peacefully that same night.
Frank Sinatra's response to the Copa Room incident reveals more about Frank than about Dean. According to those present at the Sands the following evening, Frank approaches Dean in the bar after his own performance. "You got balls, Pally," Frank says, "but you also got luck. That won't work twice." Dean's response is characteristically understated. It only had to work once. Frank doesn't understand. His experience of power involves constant negotiation, constant vigilance, constant maintenance of relationships that could turn dangerous if neglected. "You can't just ignore these people," Frank continues. "You can't pretend they don't exist." "I didn't ignore him," Dean replies. "I invited him to continue the conversation privately." "And if he'd taken you up on that invitation?" Dean considers this seriously. "Then we'd have had a conversation." Frank stares at his longtime friend and partner, searching for the bravado that must be hiding behind Dean's calm exterior, looking for the fear that any reasonable person would feel after challenging such dangerous authority. He finds neither. What Frank finds instead is something more unsettling than fear or bravado. Genuine indifference to the consequences of his actions. Dean Martin isn't pretending to be unafraid, he genuinely doesn't care what happens to him. And that psychological state, complete freedom from fear of loss, is something Frank can never replicate. Because Frank has too much to lose, too much invested in his relationships with powerful people, too much of his identity wrapped up in being important to important people. Dean has nothing to lose, except his life. And having grown up in Steubenville working steel mills and boxing rings, Dean understands that there are worse things than dying.
like living in fear. Dean Martin continued performing in Las Vegas until the late 1980s. He never spoke publicly about that March night in the Copa Room. When journalists asked about conflicts with organized crime figures, he would smile and change the subject. The man who threatened him that evening never approached Dean again. Not in person, not through intermediaries, not through any of the traditional channels of Vegas intimidation. The matter was simply closed. Not through violence, not through negotiation, not through intervention by higher authorities. Through the simple recognition that some people cannot be controlled through fear. The lesson of that evening spread quietly through Las Vegas entertainment circles, not as triumph of good over evil, but as demonstration of a psychological truth most people never learn. Real power doesn't denounce itself. Real power doesn't threaten. Real power doesn't demand respect. It simply refuses to be intimidated. Dean Martin understood something that eluded most people in positions of authority: the difference between being feared and being untouchable. Being feared requires constant maintenance. You must continue demonstrating your willingness to inflict consequences. You must keep people aware of what you can take away from them. Being untouchable requires nothing except genuine indifference to what others can take away from you. The man in the front row represented a system built on fear, on the careful calculation of what people valued most and the systematic threat to remove those things. But Dean valued nothing that could be taken from him through intimidation. His reputation? He'd been nobody before. His money? He'd been poor before. His career? He'd survived irrelevance before. His life? Well, Dean had learned early that life without freedom isn't worth preserving. That March evening in the Copa Room, 800 people witnessed something unprecedented in the history of Las Vegas entertainment. Not a confrontation between two forces, but the complete neutralization of power through absolute calm. No one was hurt that night. No one was threatened. No one was humiliated except through their own miscalculation of who they were dealing with. But everyone in the room learned something important about the nature of real power. It doesn't shout, it doesn't threaten, it doesn't demand. It simply stands its ground and invites you to test whether your threats mean anything to someone who has nothing left to lose. Dean Martin walked off that stage the same man who had walked onto it, unchanged by the threat, unimpressed by the drama, uninterested in the victory. Because for Dean Martin, there had been no victory. There had been no contest. There had only been a man who didn't understand that some people cannot be touched. That night, no one was hurt, but everyone in the room learned who could not be controlled.